Hey there, it's Dan Kenner with episode number 114 of The Casual Author. Today is Monday, April 8th, 2024, as I record this, and today we're talking to Amber Toro about successful Kickstarter launches for your books. She just finished her first Kickstarter, launching her debut novel, Umbra, and she talks a lot about her experiences going through that, how she got ideas setting it up, and the things that she's learned since getting into Kickstarter. She is not the first person I've heard say that doing Kickstarter took a lot more work than they were expecting when they first started with it. So not necessarily a bad thing, just something to be aware of. So before we dive into that interview, definitely want to go over some updates here on the Kenner Homestead as well as with my authoring. So we can start with the homestead updates today. This last Saturday was spent a lot on cleaning things out. So we set up our compost area. I talked about that a couple weeks ago. The idea with compost is when you combine what are called, greens and browns. So greens are things that were cut or removed when they were living, versus browns are things that were dead upon collection. That's a little bit confusing. But essentially, you combine those things with the perfect ratio that allows the bacteria to break them down into really nice, rich, nutrient-dense compost. It does take a lot of time though, and the most effective way to do compost is to turn it regularly. And that's been our problem in the past. We've been able to collect all of these things, well, with the animals and their manure and all of our garden scraps and the plants that we pull out of them. We have them all in piles, but they're not combined, and we haven't had the opportunity to turn them. So my wife looked up a very easy method is to set up four stalls. I say stalls loosely because they're not actually stalls. Essentially, you stick T-posts in the ground and you build it within the T-post in almost like a cube format. And then you move it from one set of T-posts to another every few days. So I started building that. And the great thing is, my sons are old enough to help. We did offer to pay them. So I think that's the big clincher because this technically does we don't really pay them for chores for keeping the house that we live in clean because that's just part of life. You clean where you live. But this is homestead stuff and it's not really it does serve them, but it's a little bit of bigger jobs that is worth paying them for in our mind. So we did pay them and they were pretty thrilled about that. You can imagine what a 9-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 6-year-old think about getting paid to do work. But they did really well. They shoveled. I just set my sons up with the wheelbarrows and they filled probably 7 or 8 of them each, which is pretty impressive in a couple hours. Of course, I had to move them around and help them dump them and shovel it out and whatnot, but it definitely saved me a lot of work. And we were able to build half of the compost pile. It compresses quite a bit though. So we build it up a little bit past half and it compresses. So I need to go continue that. Hopefully, the idea is homestead work won't take up all of the Saturdays. I'll be able to spend an hour or two actually on author things. This last Saturday didn't really happen because building the compost took a long time and I had to make sure that all the houses were put back together so that the goats could sleep in them that night. But I think moving forward, I should be able to grab a couple hours every weekend to write and or market or do whatever it is for my author business that I need to do. But yes, we are also able to sell one of our goats. So we're we're planning on keeping a couple of the goats, but the idea is we need to downsize our herd primarily because we're having a baby ourselves and it just takes a lot of work. And we are hoping to get a cow, which will serve our milk needs with one cow versus 5 goats. So, in preparation for that, we put a couple of them up for sale, and we didn't actually think that they would sell because they were pregnant. Not everybody's keen on getting a goat that's going to have babies. We did sell one of them, though. She was actually our first. One of the first goat kids we had a few years ago. She's been a wonderful goat. She usually has triplets every year. But once again, we're just downsizing. So she is now with another set of goats. It's their first Nigerian dwarf, and they're pretty excited that she's going to have babies. So honestly, she's due this week. She could have had the babies already. I don't know. But that's one thing. Now we are down to just 6 goats, 2 males and the 4 females who are all pregnant. And we'll see how it goes as they all start kidding in the next week. That's why we're focusing on cleaning up because we'll be having goat kids. I'll need to make sure to tell us, you'll be able to find pictures. If you join my email list, I'll be sending pictures every time they're born and or I'll probably be posting to Instagram, probably to TikTok, just because I don't know where else to put those pictures. I don't really have a blog or anything, but I will be putting those up there. In terms of author news, I have resumed writing Dwarf Blooded. This is book three of the Hidden Heritage series. So this is going to be a six-book series, and it's essentially a combination of like Percy Jackson and the Lorien Legacies, Portal Fantasy type half-blooded kid teenagers type expectation, and I'm really enjoying it. It's from a different person's perspective, and I'm able to write it relatively quickly in about an hour. Usually, if I'm really focused, I can get anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 words. So definitely not complaining about that. The trick is getting an hour in in a 1 day period. Sometimes I can get about 20 minutes in, and same ratio, just one third of that amount in the 20 minutes. But I'm really enjoying it though, and I think that's the most important part. I'm just shy of 34,000 words. The other two books, books one and two, ended up about 110. Through edits, we cut out about 4,000 words of Dragon Blooded, so it's down to 106. I think that's a decent size, particularly for me. I'm a very long-winded author. I do like to add a lot of detail, and some of it might not be necessary. But yeah, I'm hoping to get that book finished by July 2nd, beginning of July, pretty much. That's when the baby's due. Just trying to prepare, get that all done. And I'll probably want to shift into edits about that time because it's easier for me to edit when I'm a little bit more sleep deprived and or just things are a little chaotic because I can get little 5-10 minute editing sessions in throughout the day. It's a little bit harder to get into the zone with writing. I can do it, but the idea is I'm hoping to get Dragon Blooded published this year. So that means I need to figure out cover design. I have already had it line edited. I just need to go through and do another pass, make sure that I'm not missing anything, go through all of the edits and whatnot. And then, yeah, once I got to get the cover design, and then I just have to, what's the word, I'm like copy edit it, get some R graders. So I don't have an exact date for that, but I'm hoping probably fall of this year, I think makes the most sense. I do have to go through and edit though, and that takes some time. But other than that, yeah, I don't think I have any. Oh, the one last thing I will say is I did order through my website a book from Book Vault. So if you've been listening for a while, you'll know that I've set up my website store, my PayHip store, to print and ship directly from Book Vault. So if you want to go to PayHip, you can buy signed copies from myself. That's always been there. I have a stock behind me that I can, sign and send out. But I know some people just want to buy a book. And if you want to support me, you can now purchase through my website like Amazon. You can purchase it from, it'll come directly from Book Vault, print and ship. It's unsigned by me, but the price is a little bit lower on my website than it is on Amazon. So just keep that in mind. You do have to pay for shipping. So, maybe it's slightly more expensive. I do get paid a little bit more for those if you're hoping to buy just a print on demand, ship to your house version of my books. Unfortunately, the Cyber City book kids books are not up on my website, and that's because I don't technically own the rights to those. My publisher does, but all of my self-published books are on there, and I'm pretty happy with the quality, honestly. The paper feels a lot better. The print, the cover looks better. It's a little slightly darker, the cover, so I may need to lighten it up and re-upload it. But overall, I think I prefer the quality of Book Vault versus Amazon. And for the price, they're roughly similar in terms of print costs. So I think I'm going to always buy my author copies from Book Vault from now on. So that's a little bit of a revelation this week. Yeah, I believe that's everything in terms of updates. We can go ahead and shift over to the interview portion with Amber. Hey Amber, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing very, very well. I'm looking forward to picking your brain on all your learnings from writing and Kickstarters and everything. But before we get into all that fun stuff, how long have you been writing and publishing?
So, kind of interesting question, I guess, right? So, since I was a little kid, obviously I liked writing stories. I did creative writing in college, but I really started working on my current project actively 2 years ago. So, I'd really say, 2 years ago is when I started putting time into it and moving forward on at least my current project.
So what changed? You've had an interest in writing for some time, but why 2 years ago? Was there like a pivotal moment or
Yeah. So, 2 years ago, my dad passed away suddenly from a heart attack.
oh, okay.
And yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I would regret not having done
Mhm.
if I were to go right now. And the one thing that I always wanted to do was write the story. So yeah, I decided it was the time. And yeah, and the book is actually dedicated to my dad. It's in the
Oh,
front.
cool.
So yeah, that's kind of what pushed me towards actually making it happen.
Definitely not great circumstances. Hopefully, this is a wonderful experience as a result of that, though. I'm sorry to hear that. It's wild how life is. It's crazy like that. So, is the
Yeah.
story it's dedicated to him? Are there elements? I'm always curious to know if people have family members that are important to them that may pass away, if they include elements of them or their personalities in their books. Is that something that is a part of this book, or?
There is some. There's some that was totally unintentional. Like my editor was going through and was like, this line reminds me of The Labyrinth.
Hmm.
And I was like, that was my favorite movie to watch with my dad when I was a kid. So, that was like unintentional. And there are some kind of elements in this story around the main character and her relationship with her dad that are kind of inspired by my dad. So there are little pieces. Plus, like the other thing that me and my dad really liked together was Star Wars. So just the fact that it is sci-fi is also reminds me of my dad.
That's very cool. I mean, not that there
Yeah.
would be any expectation that it would be about him, but some I've
Yeah.
have had some people that I've chatted with who they make very large parts or elements of their story about the individual, and I was just curious to know if that was the situation here. But what a great dedication and a accomplishment to yourself. And he may not be here to see it, but I mean, what a wonderful thing to do. So that being said, I'm curious to know why you chose Kickstarter as kind of your first, because it's not published quite yet, right? It's
Correct.
almost published. So what made you decide to go with Kickstarter before publishing it anywhere else?
Yeah. So I actually was inspired by another Kickstarter that I backed last year, and it was a
Hmm.
YA sci-fi debut, Suspended in the Stars by E.A. Hendricks. And I just loved her campaign. I loved how she got her book out there. She did these really beautiful special editions, which I would love. Like, I was like, I would love to do that for my book as well. So I had seen, other authors do really cool things that way with their debuts. And that is what I'm doing with Umbra as well. The all of the physical editions are special editions. So they have sprayed edges and gold foil print covers and character art end pages. So I just wanted the opportunity to make these really special books for those first editions that are going out.
I think that's amazing, and that there's a lot of resources online and examples for you to use. I mean, this is your first time publishing, and you're going big, right? It's no small endeavor to get a Kickstarter and all the materials. And do you have a specific resource that you've used that has been most helpful in preparing and launching your Kickstarter?
So what I did was just went and looked at campaigns that I enjoyed and I've backed because I've backed several because
Mhm.
they're really fun,
They are
right?
fun.
And so I went and looked and I was like, what did I like about this campaign as a backer? And then I modeled my campaign off of those things.
Nice. I've thought about doing that. I probably backed, I don't know, I'd have to look 25, 26. I've backed tons
Yeah,
over the
it
past
gets
years because
addicting.
it is kind of addicting. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where I do like special editions of things, and even if it's going to be some time before I have an opportunity to read it, I do like supporting authors.
Yes.
Someday I may do a Kickstarter when I can actually kick my butt and do it, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah.
But I mean, what a great way
Well,
for you to get what you need from those other examples.
yeah. No, it's really fun. And they are a lot of work. It's more work than I anticipated. Even like on paper, right? You outline all of it and you know what it's going to take. But then being in the middle of it, they do take quite a bit of attention. So I do think you have to be ready to kind of dedicate that time.
So I'm glad you mentioned that because you're not the first person I've heard say that they didn't expect the amount of work that actually went into it. So how are you keeping everything organized? What are some methods that you
Yeah.
have to make sure you have everything in place?
So I'm a big data nerd. So I have all my spreadsheets. I have spreadsheets for Kickstarter, for my content, for my publishing deadlines. So it's mostly that. If I have everything, in one place, and then around other pieces like vendors and things like that, like I have I have a spreadsheet where I have all the vendors I've contacted and the pricing and things like that. So just trying to keep it all organized so I can easily access it. Yeah.
So All of that is amazing and very logical for someone like myself who I'm not very organized by nature, which is a tad bit ironic. How do you recommend getting started, right? Because that's something that's just ingrained in you. I think you do stuff like this for your work. Um, so what do you recommend to someone who maybe isn't as organized? What's the highest priority thing that they may need to do going into a Kickstarter?
So, man, the highest priority. I guess I would just start by building out your campaign because you have to walk through and you have to set everything up and submit it for review.
That's right.
And then, right? And then you get that pre-campaign status link that you can start sharing. That was one that I found out from other authors. I had no idea was really important that you get people following the campaign before it launches so that when it launches, people are ready to, hear about it and back your campaign. So I'd say just start by walking through and setting up your campaign. And then, like I did, just what's a campaign you like? And then you can kind of model your campaign after that. I think that's where I would start.
Yeah, I like that. I'm glad you mentioned that because I've heard a lot from people about the pre-page. What's it called? The launch page? It has a
Yeah, I
name.
don't remember.
I
Yeah,
don't
like
know
the
what it's
pre-launch.
called.
Yeah, probably pre-launch page.
Pre-launch page. That is
Yeah,
key, and to kind of get the news out as early as, I mean, not too far, right? If you're looking 6 months
yeah.
in the future, I'm sure people might get tired of it, but weeks,
So at
months
least
into
a
the
month,
future. Yeah.
I would say. Yeah,
Because then people have the opportunity to be prepared for that. And then I think you hit your target pretty quick, from what I understand, correct?
yeah. We funded in just over 24 hours.
Okay.
So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. But yeah, I
Very,
think you
very good.
definitely have to have people following along, right, and ready to see what you have going on when it launches.
Yeah. So for the actual book itself, I mean, we talked a little bit about the Kickstarter and the success of it, which I think is awesome. Congratulations to you on that. It's got to be very exciting. But for the actual formulation of the story, you see, because you're an organized person, I'm curious, do you tend to plot most of your story? Did you have this all plotted out prior to writing it?
So that's funny because I thought I was a pantser when I started.
Okay.
And yeah, so I just had a general idea. I've learned I'm more of like a plantster. So I like to have general plot points, but for me, the fun is sitting down and figuring out how we're getting to the next piece with the
Mhm.
characters. So there is
Yeah.
still like, yeah, a lot of flexibility and a lot of unknown. So I do know what's happening in the whole series in general and like major plot points that we need to hit, but then there's still a lot that I don't know until we get in there and write it.
Well, I mean, I think it's awesome. Everyone has their own writing style, but I think it's very interesting that outside of your writing, you're very to the T organized, spreadsheet after spreadsheet type of person, and then it's a little bit looser when you get into the writing. But I agree, that is the fun aspects of it. Were there anything in your story that surprised you, you weren't expecting as you were writing it? No spoilers here, but did you run into
Yeah.
any of that?
Yeah. So I guess maybe one of the interesting things is how the characters grow.
Mhm.
There's two side characters that, they kind of existed in the beginning, but they really grew through the editing process. So it's like, oh, I didn't know that there was so much to you. And I know they're like some of my beta readers' favorite characters, and they weren't really a core part of the story when I first wrote it. So that was interesting.
That is very interesting. Do you anticipate doing more with those characters in future books because they came out of the woodworks a little bit?
Maybe. There's definitely
Maybe.
already a request for a spin-off for them, but I need to get through the first trilogy first.
What, you mean people are requesting more books that you can actually finish? I feel like there's always finish this book, write this book. Like I would love to if there was
Right.
more time. So I've got quite a long list of books that
Yeah.
I would like to write. Maybe I'll get to them someday. I don't know. We're young. Maybe we can find
Right.
time for it. But so, what was your favorite part of the creation process, other than, what you described of just f figuring out where the characters grow? Did you have a favorite part?
Yeah. I mean, I really like the drafting because that's the creative part. That part's really relaxing. You just get to sit down and have fun.
Hmm.
I also liked a lot of the early editing where you start to see where you set things up, but maybe you weave everything together better. Like that's really fun too of like, oh, I didn't even realize I set this up when I first drafted it. I think kind of piecing together the puzzle pieces, that's really fun also.
I agree. I think those are the more fun aspects for myself. Where I really run into a wall is the later versions of editing. It feels like I hit a mental block, and it's almost like I think it's I don't know if it's a dopamine hunger or something, wanting something new and wanting to get into something new, but I struggle getting into those later aspects. Did you have a lot of drafts of your book as you were editing?
Yeah. So I followed the 7 draft method. That's
Okay.
like a book on editing I picked up. And then all said and done, I think it's about 12 drafts. And like you said, man, those final ones where you're agonizing over the word choice and the sentence structure, those are really mentally draining for me,
Hmm.
where it's like it's not as fun, but you really want it to be exactly what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, I've never heard of the seven drafts method. And while I don't want you to like necessarily give a summary of the entire thing, but what's the what's the premise of this editing method? I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, I really liked it because obviously this is my first book and editing is so much that it was really nice to have a framework. It made it feel a lot more manageable and productive. And basically, you go from like macro to micro edits. So, you have your first draft, and then you have a story draft, and then you have a character draft. So, you're just moving through, and each time it's getting more focused until, you get all the way down to line edits.
So does that are you actually reading through word by word for every single one of those drafts?
Yeah. And for the character draft, I read it for each character. So I read their point of view and then the scenes they were in. And there's 3 point of view characters. So there's essentially 3 drafts that I hit for them because you're going through with them and being sure that they're always being consistent and working from their motives and speaking the way that they speak. Um, so yeah, that's where we hit like kind of that 12 draft number of, yeah, you're moving all the way through the whole story every time.
I'm wildly impressed. I'm convinced that I could not read my book that many times in a row. Granted, I haven't actually tried, so maybe I should not downplay myself. How did
You do
you
take
have the,
some breaks.
okay,
So
that's fair.
that
So
matters.
what do those breaks look like? Are we talking like months breaks, week breaks,
Like a
or
week.
okay.
Yeah. A week or two. I had a longer break while I waited for beta readers, right? Like that one was like a month where you're waiting for people to actually give you feedback. And that was nice because then you come in really fresh when you're looking at the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting how everybody has different processes in terms of editing as well as writing. But yeah, I definitely did
Yeah.
not have 12 drafts of my first book. Whether or not that's a good thing or not, I don't know. It's hard to say.
Sure.
But I think the tricky thing is just remembering the importance of editing and just trying to have the patience through it.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for someone who maybe is on the third draft and they're like, I don't know if I can do this anymore? Any push through advice for
Yeah.
that?
So I saw something and it said something about how, those polished manuscripts, they show based on the time you invest in them and the time you give them to grow. And so that's the time where you take that break. So if you're really feeling like I can't, I can't do any more of this, it's overwhelming or I don't know, like you're not liking your story right now, a lot of times yeah, I think you just need to walk away for like a week or two. And then you come back and see it with fresh eyes and you're like, "Oh yeah, this is really great. I just needed that time for I really think you're subconscious to think through how everything fits together and maybe what needs to happen to make it like really shine." So I think that like both spending the time, but also taking the break when you need it.
So, I think taking the break is a very important thing. I don't do it that way. I do something a little bit different where I will write the entire first draft and then I will actually set it aside for a long time, up to 6 months, and I'll work on
Oh, wow,
something
6 months.
else. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's just for me, obviously it's different for everybody, but I'm not sure a week is enough time for me necessarily. I think
Oh,
probably a
yeah.
month would be enough time, but I have a hard time like sitting and not being productive. So I'm
Yeah.
like, if I've set aside a story, then I need to work on something else. And so I'll just pick up another
Yeah.
book and write another book or write a short story or something, just so I feel like I'm continuing to make progress on writing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Well,
think
and I
go
totally
ahead.
agree with you. I agree with you, especially that first draft. I set it aside for a month. First draft, a month. The week is more like all those smaller.
I
right?
see. That
The
makes
the smaller
sense.
draft. So I 100% agree with that. The first draft, you have got to like let it rest for a month for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously it
Yeah.
works different for everybody, but
Well,
I could see the
yeah.
short edits,
Or
the
my
week.
process also.
Well,
I needed that break, just like you said.
I think
Yeah.
that's the thing is sometimes it's hard to walk away because you feel like
Yeah.
if I walk away from this, am I never going to finish it? But I just don't think that's really a problem for a lot of people because you will
No.
always feel that draw back to the
Yeah, I
story.
feel like if you take the break, actually it's that, right? You're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to get back to it."
Hmm.
And that like that's when you're ready, right? Of okay, you've walked away and you're fresh and it's exciting. And then I agree with you too, like I like to write. I like to write something in the break that's totally different. I think that is fun and refreshing too.
It can be, yeah, unless if you have trouble keeping track of like admittedly there was at one point when I was writing two books consecutively, which I don't really do anymore. Most of the time I work on one until at least it's done. But one of them was in first person, the other one was in third person. And so
Oh,
sometimes
interesting.
they kind of bleed into each other on accident. And so when I got to the editing phase, I was like, what even happened here? So obviously be a little careful with that. But
Yeah.
so what other things have you been working on now that Umbra is kind of reaching the final stages of publishing? Are you working on the second book?
Yeah. So I've had two things that I've been working on through the editing process. So for NaNoWriMo, I drafted the first 30% of the next book in
Nice.
Ascension Stars trilogy. So that's like 30% drafted. And then I had to totally take a break from that since I'm doing so much editing and I didn't want to maybe confuse things between the first two books. And so while I was waiting for beta feedback, I drafted probably 70% of a YA fantasy story for my son.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very for your son. Okay, interesting. Is
Yeah.
he an avid reader?
um, No, both of my kids were working on it, right? Also, that's why I picked up your books for them,
Oh, okay.
trying to get them excited. Um, no, we're working on that. I like for all of us, I know I didn't really get into reading until you found like that book, right? Where you're like,
Hmm.
oh, this book is so cool. I can't put it down. And so we're kind of working on that with my kids, but they're super supportive of my books. Like they're so cute. Every time I get a new proof copy, they're like, "Where's my copy?" So I always have to order three.
That's awesome.
And they have them on their bookshelves. And I wrote a novelette for my daughter, which was published in the anthology in November. So
Cool.
that's why I then needed to write one for my son. And it was supposed to be a novelette, but it's turned into a novel. So
It happens with Panthers,
yeah,
particularly. It's just like, oh, that was not supposed to be this long. Um,
yeah,
Actually, one of the biggest challenges, I've challenged myself to enter the Writers of the Future competition every quarter, only because it's helping exercise my ability to write shorter stories. So
yeah.
I struggle
That's
with
not
that.
a skill set of mine. I have to work on that too.
How long is Umbra, if you don't mind me asking, word count wise?
Yeah. 99K.
Okay. Not terrible. I think
Yeah.
that's an
Yeah.
excellent size book, in my opinion. I think that's perfect,
Yeah.
but some people
Me
might say
too.
long,
I
but
like it. It's enough, right? When you, especially sci-fi, where you have to have some space for the world building.
yeah,
I think it's pretty respectable.
absolutely. Yeah, I think obviously
Yeah.
there's a different place and time for the various stories because I have read some 40, 50, 60,000 word books and enjoyed them, but I definitely didn't come away with a very clear understanding of the world and having been immersed in the world, more just like the story, the dialogue,
Yeah,
and the characters. So
for sure.
there's a place for everything. But so for
Yeah.
you mentioned that one book, growing up that got you into reading. I'm just curious to know what was that one book for you?
It was Time for Andrew. Have you
Time
heard
for
of that
Andrew.
one?
I have not.
It's a ghost story. It's really
Okay.
good. Yeah, it was really great. I actually just ordered it for my daughter. I'm hoping maybe she likes it.
Very
But
cool.
yeah, yeah.
That's so ghost story, but you don't write horror. Is it horror or is it just ghost story? I guess I
No,
don't
I
know the
mean,
difference.
because it's
Okay,
middle grade, right? So it
fair
can't
enough.
be that scary. But yeah, no, from what I remember, I'm actually excited to read it again with my daughter. But from what I remember, Andrew, is in present day and he ends up getting swapping places with an uncle who is a ghost who passed away, and he has to beat his uncle at marbles to get his life back. So
Fascinating. Never heard
yeah,
of this book. But what an unlikely story, a
yeah,
lot of people that I hear their first books are, in the fantasy and or sci-fi realm, but that's a whole different ballpark. I think it's very cool. Hopefully your daughter does
Yeah.
get into that. My children they just love reading so far, at least the first two, which I'm very appreciative of. Interestingly, they have very different tastes in story.
Yeah.
So as you're working with your kids, maybe it's just about finding the right thing. My oldest
Right?
son is obsessed with fantasy, like so obsessed. My second son tried reading fantasy, just not into it. He loves mysteries. He's a big mystery lover. So he
Yeah.
goes to the
That's what
library and
we're
gets all those
trying
books.
now, right? Those different kinds. Because that's,
Mhm.
especially as a reader yourself, that's hard, I think, where I'm like, I like fantasy and sci-fi. I don't know if my kids like it.
Right. And well, and the other thing
Yeah.
is there's different levels and degrees of each of those things. So, but
Yeah.
hopefully they find something that they really just get sucked into because it's so fun when you get
Yeah,
to that
for
point.
sure.
So this book that you're writing for your son, is it tangentially related to Umbra or anything, or is it just like a completely separate story?
So it's a gas lamp fantasy, and it
Nice.
actually connects to the novelette I wrote for my daughter. So they're
Okay.
set in the same world, and there's they have different casts, but there is character overlap. Where characters from her story appear in his for, a cameo. So it's my fantasy world that I'm working in for now. I have 4 stories, 5 stories planned in that world. So yeah, it's just fun.
No, that is impressive. You have a lot of things to look forward to, which I think is awesome. But
Yeah.
once you get the trilogy written and out, I think you'll feel a little bit more prepared to dive into something else. So,
Yeah, that's definitely the focus.
so
Yeah.
for the future of your books, do you anticipate doing Kickstarters for each of the consecutive Umbra series? What's the name of the series again? You mentioned it, and
Yeah. The series is the Sentient Stars.
the Sentient Stars. So you're anticipating doing Kickstarters for the next book releases as well?
Yeah, I absolutely want matching special editions for the whole trilogy. So, yeah, this time next year, we should probably be doing another Kickstarter for the next
Mhm.
book.
Very, very cool. Well, I do intend on investing years. I just haven't had. I've seen a bunch of them, and I just haven't had a chance to get to it. So I'm glad you mentioned that it's coming up on the ending soon, so that I can make sure to
Yeah.
jump on that before I miss it. But so for you, if there was someone who wanted to get into Kickstarters, where would be the first place for them to check? Do you recommend that they invest first in some or just kind of poke
Yeah.
around Kickstarter?
You absolutely should invest first. I think one, because you learn a lot about the process, like as a backer, which I think is super valuable.
Hmm.
Another thing that I've heard is people like to see that you are part of kind of that Kickstarter community when they're backing yours. And so on your project, you'll see it also lists how many that you have backed. And
That's
so if
true.
they come and see, first project 0 backed, people might be a little put off by that because they're like, well, do you really know, you know, what the community is about and how it works here. So I think it's both great for learning and, displaying that you're part of the Kickstarter community.
Yeah, I have heard that it's not that
Yeah.
necessarily people will judge you if you haven't backed any. But
Yeah.
let's just assume we've got someone, Jane comes, finds your Kickstarter through one way or another, and they see that you've backed a bunch, they might be more inclined to be like, oh yeah, this person supports the idea of Kickstarter, like you said, this
Yeah.
community that we've created, versus, oh, they haven't backed anything. Maybe they don't understand how we all work and
Yeah,
support each other.
for sure.
So something to keep in mind. That is not the sole reason. I'm so tempted by special versions. I always get on like, oh,
Yeah.
I probably won't invest in this one. And then I see the pictures. I'm like, oh, but it looks so beautiful.
I know. Yeah, me too. Me too. There's been plenty where it's like, oh, do I need another one right now? And it's like, yes, I need this. It's pretty, and this is
Yep.
it.
I just can't peruse the
Yeah.
Kickstarter site. I don't normally. I just get emails from like you or other people who I've subscribed to their email list and see the Kickstarters. But there were a couple that I just happened upon, some authors I've never even heard of, but I got this absolutely gorgeous. It's an omnibus version of this guy's trilogy. It's got the splayed edges, and this beautiful leather bound in a case.
That's
Like I can't
awesome.
believe like this is really beautiful. But someday
Yeah.
I need to get into that. So how do you go about designing these things? Did you already have artists in mind prior to
Yeah.
your special edition? How did you find those artists?
Yeah. So, I mean, the book itself, I have my cover artist. And so I already had obviously the cover and I've worked with him. And then the character art prints. So I, on Instagram, every time I see an artist that I like, I add it to a little saved folder.
Nice.
And then, when I'm ready to commission pieces, I go through and I'm like, okay, which one has the vibe that I'm looking for? And then I reach out to those artists, and it is a big process of selecting the artists and then making sure they have time for you. I know one of my artists, I booked her in August and she did my project in February. So, I mean, some of them you do have to book out quite a bit in advance. Other ones are able to get you in, right away. It just kind of depends. So, but there's quite a bit of planning around the art pieces. Yeah. And I definitely say be ready to go on those before you do the Kickstarter. Cause like I said, they get really busy and you just don't know what their availability is going to be like.
Indeed. Yeah. So a lot of really big planning ahead. So I mean, I think that's really cool. I don't know that I'd ever do a launch for one of my books with Kickstarter. Maybe someday, but I don't want to feel like it would inhibit my ability to keep writing the stories that I'm writing. I'm considering doing, special versions of things that I've already
Yeah.
published, maybe omnibus versions of the trilogies that I put out. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
I've
But
heard
yeah,
those
just
do
never
really
sure.
well. Like I heard that's a really great approach.
I think for me, I just don't know that I'd have the mindset to not only craft and edit the story, but also put into special editions while continuing writing other things. Because I'm assuming this is
Yeah.
consuming most of, or at one point, consumed most of your creative time to put into this campaign.
So that's probably where I made a little mistake on my timeline. I
Mm.
actually had to get through my line edits for my editor while supporting the campaign
Oh
start.
wow, goodness.
And yeah, that that was like just make it through.
All right, but I mean, you
um,
had a deadline
yeah.
that you
Yep.
could not. So that's one
So
way to
I don't
motivate yourself.
recommend that. I say don't do that.
I've heard from a lot of
Yeah.
people that having all of the files as ready as possible gives you that mind space to hit the Kickstarter hard. And um,
Yeah.
I think you just said that would have been nice in this case.
Yeah. Well, and so I had the Kickstarter launched right before I went into line edits. What I didn't realize is how much content creation I needed to do for my social.
I
So
see.
that is where I was a little overwhelmed. There's quite a bit of support around talking about the Kickstarter and responding to people and continuing to talk about it and the updates and what's going on. So I underestimated the content creation in campaign.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that being said, what are your biggest piece of advice for content creation? Are there systems that you use to make it easier and streamlined to create and post that content?
No, probably not.
No? Okay. That's okay.
But the piece of advice that I would say is, I mean, the whole idea, I think, with Kickstarter that people are part of the process.
Hmm.
And so you have to be ready to get like on video every day, right? Even
Mm,
just like a little story of this is where we're at, this is how it's doing, this is the update that we have on, from the printer, and it's going to look really awesome. So I think you just have to be ready. Well, and I know not everybody does that, but I do think that, especially because we're online, being able to get on your stories and show your face and talk helps people connect and feel like they're actually part of that project, which is part of the point of Kickstarter.
yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, just creating community, being personable, talking about who you are. I've seen a lot of those updates. Social media is an awesome venue for finding these people, but it can feel a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're on multiple platforms, which I believe you are, correct? You're in multiple
Yeah.
places.
Yeah. But so I create my content for Instagram and then I basically repost it to all the other platforms. So it's maybe not, the best fit for those, but I want to be able to connect with people that that's their platform of choice.
Hmm.
And, that's the best I could do because it is a lot.
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, the reason this podcast is called The Casual Author is because it's a recognition of life is life, and you do what you can in the time that you have. So
Yeah.
I repurpose things. Well, back when I was actually on social media for more than 2 seconds a day, I repurposed most of my things. because it's
Yeah,
just to create different content about the same subject for each format. It's a little bit overwhelming and too much
I
for someone
agree.
with a lot going on. Because if you're listening and you didn't realize this, Amber has a full-time job as well. So it's not like you're doing
Like
this all
most of
day
us,
every
right?
day. Yes, like most of us,
Yep.
plus the kids, and I'm sure you have other responsibilities in your life other than those things. So, but would
Yeah.
you have you had a good experience for the most part, aside from maybe a little bit of stress? Have you really enjoyed it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's so fun. And I will say, even though I think, being involved in the community is part of, it takes quite a bit of time.
Mm,
It's also part of the best part, right?
yeah.
Because you get to see people, how they react to your story. And it's so fun to support other authors and to have support from the community yourself and get to know people. Like, that's been some of the like most rewarding part, even though, of course, it takes time to get out there and get to know people. It's also a really great part.
Yeah, absolutely, and a very important part because I've
Yeah.
said this before. A lot of authors have said it. Being an author is can feel isolating in an ironic way because the stories you're crafting, the things you're putting together are often in your head and on the page. And so
Yeah.
sometimes you feel alone in the things you're experiencing when it's definitely not true. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people that are.
And I think that's why it's so important to connect into the community because also it's super emotional, right? Like there's days where you're like, this is so awesome. And then there's days like it's really hard and really overwhelming and you have a lot of doubt. And I think those, especially the hard days, are better when you're not alone and you're like,
Hmm.
yeah, everybody, it's like this for all of us
Hmm.
and we're in it together. We're a community.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very. And
Yeah.
then just the aspects of conversation and connecting with people is important for how do I say this? Having connections is good moving forward, just in case you need to help someone or you need help from someone. It
Yeah.
helps you to have those resources in a very positive way, or be that resource for other authors. I
Yeah.
mean, we're already talking about all the things you've learned, and as maybe you'll have 10 more Kickstarters under your belt in the next 10 years, and you'll be a Kickstarter expert, like a lot of
Yeah.
the
And
experts we
it's,
see today.
and like you said, a lot of the stuff I've learned along the way is because these other authors who are a step ahead of you, they're willing to share. They're talking about it and they're, willing to give you advice. And so it's a really nice thing.
That's another thing to keep in mind if you're listening and you're a new author. Don't be afraid to ask. It's not
Yeah,
bad. I would wager that a majority of authors would be totally willing to help you if you just ask. So no, there may be a select few that
definitely.
maybe aren't as friendly, but those people aren't part of the community for a reason. So we won't get into any of that. All of the authors I've talked to have been excellent though. So,
Yeah, me
but
too.
so given that this podcast episode is coming out after your Kickstarter, where can people find more information about you and your book in other formats and on other places?
Yeah. So, I mean, I need to update it, but, as the Kickstarter closes out, I'll make sure that my website is up to date to make things easy. That's ambertoro.com, which is super easy. And then, as you mentioned, I'm very active across social media. It's Amber Ray Toro on all of the platforms.
Nice.
And so, yeah, that's where I'll have my updates and my links and, where Umbra's at that point.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you joining me today. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. I hope you learned a lot about Kickstarters. I know I did. One of these days, I'm going to brave up and actually do a Kickstarter. I think for me, it's really the the constant comments of how much time it takes that worries me because I like keeping the ball rolling on writing and editing, and of course the podcast. And I fear that if I delve into a Kickstarter, that's going to consume a lot of that time. And I think I'm just not ready for it. I'm at some point I'll probably be okay with it, but right now I'm not. So I'm probably not going to do it soon. Who knows? Anything could happen. Next week we'll be talking to John McBride, who is a clean sci-fi author, kind of superhero sci-fi author. We're talking about the importance of structure in writing. He's very serious and passionate about structure in his writing and in the writing in general, as well as in formatting and making the document, the manuscript, look really well for printing. So it's a really great conversation. He's very insightful, and I think you'll enjoy that. So tune in next week. If you'd like to join me on the podcast, just head to thecasualauthor.com, fill out the pitch form there, or if you have friends, family, anybody who is related to writing, editing, cover design, anything related to authoring, publishing, would love to chat with you. So just head there and let me know, or you can email me at dan@thecasualauthor.com. I'll happy to respond. I'd love to hear from you. It's great to talk to people who and see what you think about the podcast. If you have any suggestions for me or things that you like or dislike, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to hear it. I want to make sure that this is a valuable podcast for you, anybody who's listening. So thank you again for listening to this, and I'll talk to you next week.